What purpose does the massive US military presence in the Gulf serve? Washington argues that it maintains stability and security. But with the escalating tensions in the region, will it protect US allies and interests? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finighan. Yet again, the US has threatened to strike Iran as tension between the two countries runs high. Washington accuses Tehran of a crackdown on internal protests against a worsening economic situation. In the face of US threats, Iran has warned America's allies in the region of consequences if a strike is made. Many of those allies have hosted US military assets for decades. Iran says they will be targeted if it's attacked. Washington relies heavily on its military presence in the Gulf, claiming that it's vital to the defense of the United States. We'll discuss with our guests why Washington has maintained a heavy military presence in this volatile region in a moment. But first, a report from Finighan.
With reports of hundreds killed in Iran's crackdown on protesters, domestic unrest is becoming an international crisis. US President Donald Trump has condemned the violence. He's imposed additional trade sanctions on Tehran and threatened that further action is still to come.
To all Iranian patriots, keep protesting, take over your institutions if possible, and save the name of the killers and the abusers that are abusing you. I say, make Iran great again. You know, it was a great country until these monsters came in and took it over. And it's all very fragile.
Iran's foreign minister has called for diplomacy, but says his country will respond if attacked.
We are prepared for any eventuality, and we hope that Washington will choose a wise option. It should be wary of those who seek to manipulate it to achieve their own objectives. It doesn't matter which option they choose. We are ready for it. We are prepared for the option of war, and our preparations are greater than those of the 12-day war.
The US is well positioned to take potential military action. Since the Gulf War in 1991, it's greatly ramped up its presence in the region. As of the middle of last year, there were as many as 50,000 troops deployed to at least 19 locations in and around the Gulf. The largest permanent deployment is at Al-Udeid Air Force Base in Qatar. The US Navy's 5th Fleet is stationed in Bahrain. And Camp Arif Jan in Kuwait is a major logistics hub for the US Military Central Command. All these bases are a relatively short distance from Iranian territory. The Gulf is a strategically important region. It features some of the world's largest oil and gas reserves. It also has several key shipping lanes vital to global trade. The US views Iran as a threat to stability and its allies in this vital location. It's provided support to Israel by shooting down missiles fired by Lebanon's Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen, two groups backed by Iran. And during Iran's war with Israel in June last year, the US intervened much more directly. American bombers launched strikes on 3 major Iranian nuclear facilities. But while Washington says it's seeking to protect its allies in the region, the presence of US military bases has also turned them into targets. In response to the bombings in June, Iran launched an attack on the US base in Qatar. No one was killed, but some debris did hit the capital Doha. The US military is a permanent fixture in the Middle East for the foreseeable future. But is it a force for stability or an agent of disruption? Finighan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. From here in Doha, we're joined by Rashid Al-Mohanadi. He's the Vice President of the Centre for International Policy Research. Joining us from London, Andreas Krieg, who is an Associate Professor in the School of Security Studies at King's College London. And in Miami, Florida, is Kenneth Katzman, a Senior Fellow at the Soufan Centre. Gentlemen, a welcome to you all. Rashid Al-Mohanadi, let's start with you. Picking up on what Fintan was saying at the end of his report there, is the US presence in the Gulf a force for stability or an agent of disruption? From the perspective of a small Gulf state like Qatar, does hosting a major US base genuinely enhance national security?
Well, and Adrian, this question has been floating around in social media and news. And I think, yes, hosting a major power by a small state like Qatar does enhance its security and does have a deterrence value. And we saw that last June when Iran decided to select Qatar as a target after the U.S. attack, that it was able to defend, through this relationship with the U.S., was able to defend the base. So I do think that there is a deterrence value of having a major power basing in a small state like Qatar.
Andreas, the US has maintained a large military presence in the Gulf for more than 3 decades now, as we were hearing from Fintan. In simple terms, what problem was that presence originally meant to solve, and does it still solve it today?
Well, the region was a very different region when the United States came in. And obviously it was about primarily defending the Gulf from Iranian sort of expansionism at the time and deep-seated fears about Iran. But it also was supposed to entangle, and I think that's more important, it's not a binary choice in that way. It's sort of entangling the Gulf in a security infrastructure and framework that is US-centric. And I think that is the sort of thing that most of the Gulf countries are providing, is that they have been integrating into a United States framework where they can share the burden. And where over time, and that's what we've seen over the last 30 years, the burden of protecting the region has kind of pivoted away from the United States and has been delegated increasingly to the GCC militaries. We have Qatar, we have UAE, Saudi Arabia, but also the smaller states, all providing for maritime security, providing and supporting also logistics capabilities of the United States, helping with strikes even as far as Afghanistan, but also taking over more responsibility. But obviously, I think we're now pivoting away from what used to be a very security-centric sort of framework into a more political, geopolitical framework. And I think here the Gulf states even absorb more of that burden of statecraft from the United States, because what they can bring to the table, and I think that's what's going on behind the scenes the whole time, is that sort of strategic depth that the US doesn't have anymore, the ability for countries like Qatar, like Oman, to speak directly to Iran and kind of manage relationships before they actually go across that threshold into a hot conflict, which is exactly what the Gulf states are good at. And the military, yes, it's a level of deterrent, but really what Gulf states are more comfortable with is managing relationships and crises before it actually crosses this threshold. And I think this is hopefully where the Trump administration is listening to the Gulf.
Sorry, Andreas, I'm going to ask you again. You may be repeating yourself here, but is the ongoing US deployment in the region more about protecting Gulf allies or protecting US interests? Of course, energy flows, global trade. I mean, regardless of who's in power in the region itself.
Well, it's not binary. It's not either US interests or Gulf interests. I think they're obviously intertwined in that respect. But obviously, the Middle East is no longer as important for supply chains and even for the oil trade to the United States as it once was. That certainly has changed. And hence, we've seen a pivot. We've seen a withdrawal of troops. We've seen a complete change of the relationship between the United States and the Gulf. But is it still fit for purpose? I still think so, because, again, it's more of a partnership rather than a top-down relationship. And obviously, I think over time, will draw down. The United States will draw down their footprint in the region, and they will always need a forward operating base, and that could very well be Qatar. But the expectation in Washington is that the region will have to bear more of that burden.
Kenneth, Katzman, from Washington's perspective, how much freedom of action does the US actually have in the Gulf, given that any strike that it makes risks retaliation against bases hosted by its allies, like Qatar, we've heard about, Bahrain or Kuwait?
Thank you. I think a lot of the U.S. presence was actually established to defend against Iraq. You remember Iraq invaded Kuwait, and then the Iraqi leadership, still under Saddam Hussein, was a threat. And then after the U.S. overthrew him with Gulf help in 2003, then the U.S. presence shifted more toward Iran. The U.S. has numerous missions, numerous operations that are based in the Gulf: anti-terrorism, counterterrorism, obviously deterring against Iran. You asked about freedom of action. The U.S. does have a lot of freedom of action. We, basically every time the U.S. asks for overflight rights or landing, taking off, expanding facilities, expanding bases, the Gulf states tend to concur. They tend to give approval. The U.S. has a tremendous ability to operate in the Gulf. We've seen it many times this year. The Gulf states cooperated with the defense of Israel in the June war, as well as some skirmishes between Israel and Iran in 2024. Saudi Arabia and I think Qatar also said the U.S. shouldn't use its bases to strike Iran in the current crisis over Iran. But I think, if Mr. Trump is intent on striking Iran, which we don't know, he seems to have hit pause button on that. But if he goes ahead with a strike, I'm sure the Gulf states will be, the U.S. will be operating from the Gulf states to some extent, even if maybe publicly they oppose operations from their territory. So I wouldn't underestimate the ability of the U.S. to operate freely in the Gulf, from the Gulf, in the Gulf.
Rashid, you mentioned Iran's retaliatory strike on the U.S. airbase in Qatar last year. Did that fundamentally change how Gulf capitals, Doha in particular, view the cost of hosting American bases?
Well, I think Qatar has obviously made a choice of doubling down on its U.S. partnership, especially when it comes to security, because it views the U.S. as, the most viable partner when it comes to, capacity development, capability development, especially looking at Qatar's resource restrictions like human resources and of course technology. So I think post the Iranian attack, and even post the Israeli attack, there is a doubling down of both sides because Qatar intensified its relationship with the U.S. and the U.S. has respectfully provided a high level of security guarantees through the President Trump's executive order. So I do think the trajectory is even more stronger ties, especially looking at the Qatar case. With the other Gulf actors, we see a higher level of diversification, but that's fueled by other factors.
Andreas, has the U.S. military presence reduced the risk of war, not just with Iran, but its proxies in the region, or paradoxically, has it increased it by putting American forces within easy reach of retaliation?
Well, yeah, one could make that argument that obviously having U.S. troops boots on the ground on the Arab side of the Gulf increases the unease, obviously, in Iran. But then again, I mean, the Iranians have been very careful to manage that relationship with the Gulf, and I think the Gulf have also really tried to build a very sort of careful relationship, particularly Saudi and Qatar and also Oman, where they're trying to integrate with the Western framework, the US-centric framework, while maintaining a relationship with Iran. And it was made very clear, obviously, by Qatar and Saudi that they will not allow the US to use their airspace or their bases to strike Iran, which again will have an impact on the freedom to maneuver. I mean, the US will have to now look for alternative ways if they want to strike Iran to do so. So in that respect, I think the Gulf states have retained control over it. And so far the attacks, I mean, I don't want to downplay these attacks on Qatar in June last year, but they were signaled and they were telegraphed, and in that respect allowed the Qataris to respond. This was not an all-out attack by Iran against these Gulf states, but obviously having the U.S. presence there and the U.S. being, as difficult to predict as they are at the moment, creates a risk for this to potentially escalate and drawing in the GCC forces. But so far it has been managed. And
Andreas, President Trump appears on Thursday, when we're recording this program, to pull back, or has appeared to have pulled back from the strike threats after assurances from Iran that there are no plans for executions of protesters. Has the threat now gone away, or will the US continue to move forces strategically, perhaps closer to Iran, particularly in the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, in order to keep up the pressure? Did the US actually have the forces in place to hit Iran decisively, or was what we've seen in the last 24, 36 hours saber-rattling?
Well, there's a lot in there, but I don't think there is such thing as a decisive strike against Iran, because that would require a very long, drawn-out military sort of campaign, which I don't think the Trump administration is ready for. If what they want are kind of punitive sort of standoff strikes. They would have to fly them from somewhere like Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. They don't have the capabilities yet in the region to do so. But I think what we're seeing right now is a bit of drawing in an aircraft carrier strike group to increase their capability and increase the sort of diversification of troops on the ground. I don't think it has gone away entirely, that there's this issue with Trump of that strategic ambiguity that he likes to maintain. He first builds the pressure, then he seems to pull away from that pressure, and then he actually does strike. I think it's a very, very fragile moment. A lot will actually depend on the diplomacy in the background. And in the end of the day, the Iranians have to, they have to come to the negotiation table. They have to change their way for Trump to actually say that he's achieved anything, because so far he hasn't achieved anything. So I don't think the threat has gone away, and I do think that we'll have to see what the next 48 hours bring.
All right, Kenneth, I'll come back to you in just a moment. But Rashid, talking about diplomacy, how much now are Gulf states involved in what might be going on behind the scenes, trying to de-escalate this tension?
Well, we shouldn't underplay the efforts of countries like Qatar, Oman, and Saudi Arabia in potentially delaying what was, for many observers, an inevitable strike on Iran. I do agree with Andreas' assessment that the strike assets are not there for a sustained campaign, but they can easily be moved. And I think currently there is an opening for diplomacy, and the Trump administration, at least publicly, has signaled that they're willing to pursue diplomacy. But most importantly, we have to look at the Iranian movements. So we see calls from Ali Larijani to the Qatari Prime Minister. We see calls by Arakchi to the Saudi Foreign Minister. So there are movements, and we hope the most sensible way forward is to have direct talks, which apparently for a very long time was not something both parties wanted to do.
Kenneth, two questions for you, starting with a question based on your decades of experience advising US lawmakers. Is the core logic here, as far as they're concerned, still the Strait of Hormuz, preventing Iran or anyone else from disrupting global energy markets? Or has the US mission in the Gulf quietly evolved into something else?
Well, it hasn't really evolved much. It's still very much, as we've been talking here, a deterrence mission. It's to contain Iran. It's surprising how the mission has not really evolved. And now it's very much a missile defense mission. We've seen Qatar attacked both by Israel and Iran, although, obviously the U.S. didn't defend against the Israeli attack. That was certainly an irritating issue between the U.S. and Qatar, and still ruminating even several months later. But the mission is very, very well defined. And the Gulf states are very much protected by this mission. The United States has the largest air force on the planet, and Iran has no air defense. So where does that leave Iran? Not very well defended. So I think the Gulf states understand the balance of power. They understand who they need to be aligned with. They're talking with Iran, yes, as Mohanadi said. There's talks with Iran. They don't want to be in the crossfire between Iran and the United States. They don't want to be in the crossfire between Iran and Israel. They don't want to be a battleground between Iran and other powers. That's fair. But at the end of the day, the Islamic Republic has proven itself again with these massacres of protesters, and it's very clear where the U.S. and Europe stand on Iran. The regime needs to go, and there's probably going to be further U.S. policy adjustments to try to make this regime go away.
All right. President Trump, Kenneth, says that it was the assurances over these executions, which he understands will not now proceed, that help to ease the immediate crisis. Is that evidence that the pressure, that coercion works, or that diplomacy still matters more than military deployments, or is it a case of both at work here?
Well, I think Mr. Trump's clear intent, and it looked yesterday like he was going to strike, and then the Iranians reached out to say they're not going to execute. That gave Mr. Trump a way to climb down from striking. But let's remember, it's not clear that strikes are going to change the regime in Iran. Airstrikes are not going to, to change the regime in Iran, you either need a ground force, which nobody is sending, even Mr. Trump, or, obviously what I'm thinking, it's going to evolve into, covert missions, covert action. I think in the years going on now, you're going to see more support for opposition groups by the United States inside Iran. You're going to see the U.S. working more with oppositionists, trying to build up the opposition in Iran. Cyber attacks. There are many, many ways Mr. Trump can do damage, serious damage to the Iranians without airstrikes.
Rashid, you've worked in both the energy sector and the defense industry. If tension continues to escalate, what worries Gulf governments more? Disruption to oil and LNG exports, shipping lanes, or an escalation that somehow damages their carefully balanced regional diplomacy? It somehow pits one against the other.
So Adrian, all of the above. So you look at what could go wrong if, a limited or maybe something a little bit above limited strike happens on Iran. So there is this, scenario where Iran retaliates, meaning the Gulf states are in the crossfires. So that's a security and defense risk. You have disruption to the energy corridors. You have disruption to trade and economy. And there is this scenario if there's a state collapse in Iran. Iran is a country that is 150 kilometers across the Gulf. It has 90 million people, and it has the geography of Afghanistan. So the Gulf states look at a potential military strike on Iran in the current state as very destabilizing. And that's why states like Qatar, Oman, and Saudi are pushing for more diplomacy and discussion.
Andreas, Qatar and its neighbors have invested heavily in air and missile defense, base hardening, resilience, if you like. In practical terms, are Gulf states better prepared today to absorb any hostile action, whether it comes from Iran or anywhere else, than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
Certainly better prepared than they were 5 or 10 years ago. But it really depends on what Iran is using in its arsenal. It has a very, very diversified arsenal. I think that's kind of the backbone of deterrence of the Islamic Republic, is a very, very sophisticated ballistic missile program, from tactical, operational to strategic ballistic missiles. We've obviously seen that even the most sophisticated air defense systems of Israel that the Gulf states don't even have are unable to actually protect Israel adequately against these incoming missiles. And I think so far the Iranians obviously have used slow-moving missiles. Some obviously in June 2025 against Qatar were more sophisticated, but again telegraphed. The air defense system in Qatar worked very well. The Qatar armed forces worked very well to take them down. But obviously if Iran wanted to cause damage, they could, and there'd be very little that any of the Gulf states could do against it. And obviously that would completely disrupt the way of life and also their very business model that these Gulf states have. Countries that currently focus more on development and stability than actually expansion and trying to take risks. So it's insufficient to actually protect against the potential of Iran wanting to go all out to punish the Gulf states, which I don't think they want at the moment.
Kenneth, Katzman, the Pentagon says that its current military presence in the Gulf is all about deterrence. But deterrence of what exactly? Against Iran's nuclear proliferation, regional proxy warfare, attacks on shipping, regime behavior, Iran's, of course. If the US were designing its Gulf posture from scratch today, given what we know now, would it look anything like it does today?
Well, I'm not sure. It's hard to say. As we said, it evolved. It began more as a ground deterrence against Saddam Hussein. So very heavy on, U.S. Army tanks, armored personnel carriers. I think it would evolve differently. The threat from Iran is different. Iran does not have a land invasion capability against the Gulf. It does not really have ability to land forces across the Strait of Hormuz either. Does not have an airlift capability, does not have an amphibious capability. So I think it would be very much focused more on defense against drones, defense against short-range ballistic missiles, much more, fires, they call it, I suppose, rather than, maneuver on the ground. But the deterrence mission is still there. I mean, Iran, even this week, keeps threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz. So the U.S. presence is crucial to deterring that. If Iran were to try to close the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. Navy would have to open the Strait of Hormuz up again, which they could do in 2 hours. But they would have to do it, and it does risk casualties. The Iranians have attached explosive devices to tankers. They've seized tankers. They've attacked tankers in the Gulf. So there are missions Iran has used to intimidate the Gulf states, and the U.S. presence is deterring it against that.
Kenneth, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Time is rapidly running out. I want to get one more question in for Rashid. As Gulf states, Rashid, pursue more strategic autonomy, developing local defense industries, they're diversifying partnerships, does the long-term U.S. military presence still align with their interests, or is it becoming something that they perhaps increasingly want to hedge against rather than rely on?
Well, that's a good question, Adrian. Looking at the trajectory of things, U.S. presence has been in the Gulf since the Cold War, since the unipolar moment in the 90s, and now us moving towards a more multipolar world. And I think the U.S. will double down on the region because U.S. interests in this region is almost equivalent to U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific if it comes to looking at trade routes, energy corridors, and all the other stuff that's associated to the great power competition. In terms of Gulf states, I think it's obvious the Gulf states, at least for the next few decades, have locked in their security relationship with the U.S., but they're still diversifying economically with actors like China and India and the rest of the global South. So I view it as this duality where in the security angle, you're doubling down your relationship with the US, which is obvious. But in the economy and technology sectors, you are diversifying.
All right. There, gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it. Rashid, Al-Mohanadi, Andreas, Krieg, and Kenneth Katzman, many thanks indeed. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X at any time. Our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Bye for now.